Ashwini Deo. Oh, sorry, yes, I meant to mention that at this point, the recording will begin. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Ashwini Deo, our colloquium speaker for today. Professor Deo has held faculty positions at Yale University and The Ohio State University. Don't hold it against her, please. And is currently professor at the University of Texas at Austin. Her research has contributed greatly to our understanding of semantics and semantic change, including work on fun functional items like negation, tense and aspect, possessives, discourse particles, little words that make a big difference. She also works on case and agreement phenomena, and her data for all this incredible work is often drawn from Indo-Aryan language families, such as today's work. Her work is prodigious. I was embarrassed looking at her CV with all the papers in some of our top journals, contributions to edited volumes in a wide range of various topics, and presentations at a lot of conferences, invited talks like this one. So we are very pleased to have her with us today. Now, I'm particularly excited to hear from Professor Deo today about this particle found in several Indo-Aryan languages, which is used to coordinate joint participants in a discourse. So this and a lot of other work of hers, I think, is particularly interesting to our community here at Michigan because it bridges a gap between the sort of topics traditionally covered in theoretical linguistics classes and work, like truth conditional semantics and other broader linguistic practices like discourse pragmatics and beyond. Without anything further, I will be quiet and let us welcome Professor Deo.
Thank you, Ezra, for that generous introduction. And thank you, everyone, for inviting me to give a talk. I wish I could have come there in person, but I'm so happy to see you all virtually. Well, I did see the watch party at the very beginning. I can't see them anymore, but the watch party idea is fantastic. I'm going to try and see if we can emulate it here at UT. So I will share my screen now, and I'm realizing that I will talk to no one that I can see because this is a webinar, but do let me know if there are any issues and I will try to keep track. Is everything clear? Shall I start?
Yes, it looks great. We'll monitor the chat and the watch party and let you know if there's anything that you need to know about. Okay. But yes, it looks great.
Okay, I'm just going to close everything, the chat and everything. All right, great. As Ezra said, one of my interests is discourse particles and what they contribute to the utterances that they occur in. And I'm interested in them from a cross-linguistic perspective, as well as the kind of intra-language perspective. And this sort of work on discourse particles has flourished in the past couple of decades. And cross-linguistic investigation of these expressions has revealed a wide variety of kind of functions that they have as they track and regulate the flow of information in discourse, right? Discourse particles convey information about speaker attitudes towards propositional content, the assumptions that speakers might make about their interlocutors' information states, or speaker perspectives on how particular contents, what their contributions are, fit within larger sequences of discourse moves, questioning, answering, for instance, and the changing common ground. So when you have conventionalized packaging for this type of content, right? So when you have discourse particles, and you'll see a bunch of them from English, just to see what I mean. But when you have such conventionalized packaging, it just allows interlocutors to efficiently coordinate on their understanding of what the discourse is like, right? And what the speaker's view of the discourse is. So that's what makes them really exciting. But the precise contributions of discourse particles are notoriously hard for even native speakers to pin down, even in better studied languages. So the bulk of work is English, German, Germanic languages, some Romance languages. And it's really hard. Everybody recognizes that, you know, figuring out the precise contribution of a discourse particle is a formidable challenge for people who do formal pragmatics. And the difficulty of pinning them down, for those of you who might do fieldwork or documentation working on languages that you don't speak natively, you will appreciate this, that the difficulty of pinning the meanings of these discourse particles down creates a kind of bottleneck in the setting of understudied languages, where native speakers might often be consultants to some linguist, right, rather than the linguist themselves, right? So we are talking about a degree of separation between the intuitions that are offered and the analysis that is conducted on the basis of these. A consequence is that discourse particles still remain understudied as a cross-linguistic phenomenon. But based on what we know about them, these little things, these little particles raise several interesting questions. So, for instance, what discourse structuring functions do particular discourse particles have, right? So if you have a discourse particle in language X, you know, what is that particular expression doing? But you might ask a more typologically oriented question. If a discourse particle does, you know, has function A, B, and C, do A, B, and C cluster together in the same particle, right, across languages? So what discourse structuring functions are found clustered together in single lexical items across languages? And how might sets of discourse structuring functions relate to each other? So in general, one might ask the question, are there higher level properties, right? Some properties that cut across different discourse particles that might help us model the conventional contributions of these expressions across languages. So I'm kind of trying to make a dent into this question by looking at one tiny little discourse particle in Marathi. And in this talk, I'm going to try and shed light on the empirical picture. And I note that this hasn't been done for Indo-Aryan systematically. So when I'm doing it for Marathi, in some sense, I'm offering a picture of the landscape for several Indo-Aryan languages, because this particle functions in almost identical ways across several languages. I'll identify the necessary elements for its formal analysis and consider implications for the cross-linguistic picture towards the very end. Okay, let's move into this Marathi data. Marathi is an Indo-Aryan language with a history of around 1100 years. A population is oh, I did it wrong. Okay, it's greater than 80 million. And this is basically just a linguistic map of India that tells you which language families are spoken. And the light blue area here is the Indo-Aryan area. Zooming in a little bit, you see that Marathi is spoken in this region. If you can see my cursor moving a little bit. And to the north is Hindi, to the west is Gujarati, and to the south are the Dravidian languages. So this just kind of gives you a picture of the geographical extent of Marathi. Let's move on to Tsa. This particle is a multifunctional discourse clitic. It's an enclitic with almost perfect counterparts in several Indo-Aryan languages. So Hindi has an enclitic he, Bangla has e, Gujarati has ja. And in fact, if you go back a couple thousand years, Sanskrit has eva, which is the cognate for all of these languages and functions pretty similarly to the modern Marathi clitic as well. These are all constituent focus particles. They encliticize to a focus containing phrase, but their contribution is best understood as being across the whole proposition. And what I'm going to draw your attention to here is the clustering of effects that is associated with "z," which is quite unexpected given standard analyses of Germanic and Romance particles. And you'll see through this talk that just is kind of, English just is similar, but not really. Okay, so we'll see how the comparison goes through. Hindi he has been studied a little bit, but not systematically. And people have noted that it has effects comparable to exclusives, but also scalar additives like even, but they also contributes emphasis, intensification, discourse groundedness. So we'll see all these, what these words mean as we come to the examples. Okay. So just to give you a sense of what it's doing in English before we dive into the Marathi data. So it can work like indeed, which is a marker of kind of the salience of the proposition that is provided as an answer in a context. So for instance, A asks, does Deepa live on the top floor? Indeed, she does. Okay, so it can be like this, okay? This or that vary, which are like anaphoric demonstratives. So imagine A asks, which sari did Deepa wear to the party last night? And B says, do you know her mother's wedding sari? She wore that very sari. So I can do this. In both these cases, what we are talking about is a certain kind of salience for the answer that is coming from the way in which interlocutors are talking to each other in that discourse context, okay? But it can also work like only, so exclusives. So only just 10 girls came to the meeting. That's the kind of meaning that can be contributed by "z." But also right, exactly. So right then, my daughter fell off the stairs. They lost power in absolutely every neighborhood. So I can do this stuff too. Okay, just look at the number of particles we have in English whose job is supposed to be doing single-handedly, okay? Yesterday, it really rained a lot, intensification. The food is definitely very tasty or really very tasty. So I can also do this. Mirativity that is expressed by English just. So this is not the just of John is just a freshman, right? This is a just that says that whatever we are talking about is beyond what was expected, right? So it's counter-expectational where the facts are above what we might have expected. So she just invited her whole class to the party. And something like even. So Anu doesn't even speak Hindi, right? So let alone some other, a more complex language like Bhojpuri. So you have the sense of the range of effects that are associated with this single particle. And there's a few kind of aspects to this puzzle that I want to highlight here. Nothing has been similarly, nothing similar has been previously described in the study of discourse particles in any language. So why do we get this clustering of diverse effects? The literature on discourse-sensitive expressions offers detailed, very, very good pragmatic analyses of the contributions of exclusives like only and just, scalar additives like even, intensifiers like just and really, precisifiers. But these are customized to each type of meaning, right? So we have analyses for exclusives and analyses for intensifiers. How do we reconcile these effects when they arise from a single lexical item? The clustering that we observe in Marathi is synchronically widespread, and it's arguably a pan-Indo-Aryan pattern. So we are not talking about something that accidentally happened to be the case in one little language, right? One small speech community doing something weird. We're talking about something that's performed by, that's controlled by, expertly by several speech communities. So the question can be stated as, why do we get these functional cognates across Indo-Aryan? And I suggest that this synchronic widespreadness points to the possibility that the clustering is part of a diachronically inherited grammatical core, right? So that it's not independent developments in these languages, but rather what we have is a pattern that has been inherited over millennia, I believe, for these languages. So what might such historically stable clustering of uses imply? And one thing that I want to kind of push for is that the stability in the clustering across related languages makes it rather likely that what we are talking about is not an accidental clustering of features, but a single core of conventionalized discourse functional meaning in interaction with specific contextual conditions. So we have to look for a unified meaning. Okay, that's what I would kind of, and this is a first attempt at suggesting what this sort of meaning might be. What could this conventionalized meaning be, and how does it generate the observed diverse effects in interaction with different contextual conditions? Okay, so I want to start kind of getting your intuitions in place by looking at one of the uses of tse, which have to do with salience in the discourse context, okay? And the way we will do this is by considering two minimal pair contexts, and notice that tse is acceptable in one of those and infelicitous in another context. So consider C1, okay? Anu and Bilal are visiting Deepa and arrive at her apartment building, and Anu asks, so does Deepa live on the top floor? She has rendered a particular expression, a particular proposition salient through the polar question, does Deepa live on the top floor? Bilal can answer, yes, she lives on the top floor, sir. Okay, so this is very similar to indeed. C2 is a minimally distinct context. Anu and Bilal are visiting Deepa, arrive at her apartment building. Anu says, so does Deepa live on the ground floor? B cannot respond with she lives on the top floor indeed. And you get this jarring effect if you produce indeed in response to context 2 as well, right? So it says like indeed. What we get from here is that tse can be felicitously attached to an answer constituent if the prejacent, by the prejacent I mean the sentence that contains tse, just to, in case that word is not familiar. If the prejacent offers an answer that is aligned with an alternative that has been explicitly rendered mutually salient at the context. Okay, here's another example. Bilal was at work last night and Anu wants to know how he got home. She asks, did Nisha drive you home last night? Nisha, tse dropped me off. Indeed, Nisha dropped me off. Perfectly fine. But if Anu frames her question differently, if she doesn't make the proposition salient, if she asks, who drove you home last night, as in context 2, tse becomes unacceptable, okay? A speaker might make a constituent, an answer salient, and which might not be the appropriate answer. So let's look at the contrast between C1 and C2 here. Anu has never met Bilal's sister, wants to be introduced at a party. Anu says, where is your sister, or which woman is your sister? Bilal coordinates the attention onto a particular individual saying, do you see that tall woman in the sky blue dress? She tse is my sister, or that woman tse is my sister. Perfect, okay? But if Anu asks a question like the one in C2, she says, Bilal, is your sister the one wearing the green sari? Bilal looks to see, says, no, 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 you're wrong. Do you see this other woman? She is my sister. Tse is unacceptable in this context, okay? So what we can see from this is that tse can be felicitously attached to the answer constituent if the prejacent offers an answer that is explicitly rendered salient and there is no competing salient alternative at the context. So far, what you've seen is the answer that has been rendered salient through explicit discourse moves. We can have discourse salience that comes from the assumptions, the backgrounds, the expectations, the beliefs of the speaker as well. And here's an example for that. Okay, so this is kind of a minimally different version from something you just saw, if you remember. Bilal was at work last night. Anu wants to know how he got back home. And what's critical here is that it is commonly known that Nisha usually drops Bilal off when they have to stay late at the night. So this is in the background of the interlocutors, okay? And Anu asks, who drove you home last night? Nisha tse dropped me off is perfectly fine. The answer in 4, okay? Nisha nets mala sodla, okay? In C2, we do not have that commonly shared assumption that Nisha is the usual dropper off for Bilal. So Bilal was working late. Anu wants to know how he got home. She asks, who drove you home last night? 4 is infelicitous. Nisha nets mala sodla is out because there is no priorly shared belief that Nisha is the usual person who drops Bilal off. Okay, so Tsa can be felicitously attached to the answer constituent if the prejacent offers an answer that is mutually salient, but now the salience is based on the commonly shared past experience of the interlocutors, not on what has been said, uttered in the discourse context. It just has to do with what is in the common ground for both of them. Okay. Okay. So Tsa can be used in contexts where an alternative answer has been explicitly rendered salient. The speaker can draw on mutually accessible information, perceptual or otherwise. For instance, Bilal might point at the woman who is his sister in order to mark their answer as mutually salient, as long as there is no contextually salient competing alternative. And Tsa can also be used in contexts where the salience of an alternative answer is rooted in interlocutors' beliefs about each other's beliefs and expectations. Okay? So in other words, Tsa can mark what I'm calling the discourse-sensitive salience of the prejacent, which emerges from the prior discourse moves, interlocutor beliefs, and these allow the interlocutors to be coordinated on a unique alternative at the relevant stage of the discourse. But this is only one class of the uses of Tsa. How can it be reconciled with the full set of observed effects, which we will see in a second? What is the connection between these discourse-sensitive effects, which you just saw, and scale-sensitive effects, which I talked about at the beginning? Exclusives like only, precisifiers like exactly, intensifiers like really, mirative markers, scalar additives, and so on. So how do we want to connect discourse sensitivity or discourse-based salience with scale sensitivity, sensitivity to how information might be ordered among interlocutors? Okay, and the answer that I'm trying to kind of work with is the following, and this is what I'm going to try and hopefully convince you of, is that the scale-sensitive effects of Tsa arise when the prejacent is presupposed to be located at some salient position in an ordered question, a scalar endpoint of a question. Okay? So the main idea here is that Tsa uniformly signals that the interlocutors can be in agreement that the proposition denoted by the prejacent is uniquely salient among alternatives. That is, the answer provided by the prejacent uniquely stands out among the alternatives in the current question. This amounts to a signal that the interlocutors are coordinated with respect to crucial aspects of the structure and the content of the current question. And by the current question, I'm kind of using the QUD framework that is used in formal pragmatics, where discourse is kind of structured by a series of questions that determine how interlocutors take turns as they inquire into the state of the world. Okay. So Tsa conveys that the proposition expressed by the prejacent is a Schelling point or a focal point among the alternatives in the current question. What do I mean by this? So the idea comes from a political strategist and economist, Thomas Schelling, who basically introduced the idea that speakers tend to coordinate or converge on solutions by default. And Schelling points are such salient solutions that cooperating players can come up with, they can coordinate on, when one among many alternatives is to be chosen without explicit communication, right? So the kind of problems that he asked people to solve were, well, you're in New York City and you have to meet somebody, but you can't talk to each other about when you need to meet. Where would you meet and when? And the most commonly given answer was Grand Central Terminal at noon, okay, under the clock or something like that. So these are basically problems which have multiple alternative answers, and a Schelling point is the sort of answer that speakers, interlocutors, or coordinating players, cooperating players are able to coordinate on without explicitly communicating. It is critical here that the players converge on a unique alternative, which means that each player should select an alternative that they find noticeable and expect the other person to also find noticeable. Schelling points are not based on anything formal. They are based on informal appeals about salience to human intuitions. Okay, so let's work with some of these. So this is based on Potts papers, and here's a problem for you. Look at the following diagram and select a shape token. You will be rewarded just in case you pick the same token as everyone else. So you can put your answer in chat, or you can produce it. What is the token that you pick? If I get a few answers in chat, then we can kind of move forward.
I just opened up the chat to everyone. Okay.
Okay. All right. So we are immediately making Schelling look bad here. So okay. So this is a far more diverse set of answers than I usually get. So most people typically do the one in the center, which is what Anna has selected here. You're only supposed to see gray boxes. Gray boxes are the shape token, and you were supposed to be selecting one of these. Maybe life will be easier in a second, okay? So look at the following diagram and select a shape token. You will be rewarded just in case you pick the same token as everyone else. Same task. What are you going to pick? Okay. Bottom left, the oval bottom left. Okay, so you see, right? So this is the odd one out, exactly, or something that makes it prominent. In this case, it's the same one. You typically pick the blue rectangle rather than any of the other ones, given that it's prominent, right? So this was kind of the idea that in the absence of communication, you're able to coordinate on a unique solution despite on the basis of some sort of a special property that it might have. In the case of all gray boxes, it was, the property of being in the center that would have been the determinant of the Schelling point in that case. We'll just do one more and see if this works. If it doesn't work, blame Schelling, not me, because these are his numbers. Select one of the numbers listed in the line below. You'll be rewarded just in case you pick the same number as everyone else. Okay, so if you want to select, we can, okay. So this is an extremely non-cooperating group of people, I would say. Savi has 7 and Demet has 261, but most of you guys have 100, right? Which is also what Schelling has. It's okay, Savi, you can coordinate later. So 100 is what most people pick. And so this is the idea. Okay, so this is what Schelling says. People can often concert their intentions or expectations with others if each know that the other is trying to do the same. Most situations, perhaps every situation for people who are practiced at this kind of game, provide some clue for coordinating behavior, some focal point for each person's expectation of what the other expects him to expect to be expected to do, right? So this is very Stalnekerian in some sense, right? This is how the common ground is also talked about, right? Things that I know that you know that I know that you know is being taken for granted, right? So finding the key, or rather finding a key, any key that is mutually recognized as the key becomes the key, may depend on imagination more than on logic. It may depend on analogy, precedent, accidental arrangement, symmetry, aesthetic or geometric configuration, casuistic reasoning, and who the parties are and what they know about each other. Critically, it is not given formally by some algorithm, right? It is something that interlocutors who must coordinate do in order to coordinate, okay? Oops, sorry. I have to change my slide, and I think this should work. Okay. No single principle determines the distribution of Schelling points. A Schelling point does not have to be uniquely good. Indeed, it could be uniquely bad, as Lewis says. It merely has to be unique in some way that the subjects will notice, expect each other to notice, and so on. It must be cognitively prominent enough for interlocutors to be mutually recognizable as a point of coordination. The claim that I want to make and that I'll try to argue for in the next several minutes that I have is that Sir presupposes that the proposition expressed by the prejacent is a Schelling point among the alternatives in the question under discussion or the current question. Okay? That is, Sir presupposes that the prejacent interpretation can be coordinated on by interlocutors by virtue of it being uniquely salient. So let's move on to what I'm calling the scale-sensitive effects with Sir. You've already seen these discourse-sensitive effects where prior discourse moves kind of make some proposition salient, and then you can stick on Sir there to convey that it is uniquely salient to the interlocutors. But in each of these cases, what you will see is that there is no contextual production of the proposition that is given. There is just some answer that's given, and that answer tends to be interpreted in a particular way if Sir is present. Okay, so let's look at the exclusive readings. Sir can have an exclusive-like effect in terms of ruling out all stronger alternatives like only, and giving rise to a weaker than expected effect. So here's the context. Last week, 20 girls attended the Zoom meeting that Anu had organized, and Bilal wants to know about this week's meeting. Bilal says, how many girls showed up at your meeting yesterday? Anu says, the turnout was a little lower. There were 10 Sir girls at the meeting. Okay, there were only 10 girls at the meeting. This is what Sir does when it criticizes to a numerical expression like Sir. Okay, it always, when it attaches to a numerical expression, you get the exclusive reading here, okay? A second example, Anu had invited a friend for dinner. Bilal is excited to know more about the food she cooked. Bilal says, what did you make for dinner? Anu says, I kept it simple. I made pulao. Okay, I made only pulao is the inference, is the kind of translation, the appropriate sentence in this context, okay? And this gives rise to the inference that she made nothing other than pulao, and that she was expected to make a more elaborate dinner than one that only contains pulao. A pulao is just a spiced rice dish that is made across the subcontinent, in case the word is not familiar. Okay, I'm going to skip through the rank order readings, but Sir also affects precisification, as I said, when it occurs with vague amount or manner expressions. It leads to stricter interpretations of these expressions, like exactly. So here's the context. Anu is trying out Bilal's recipe for a dish with rice and lentils. Bilal says, how much rice should I put in? Bilal says, measure carefully, take exactly as much rice as the lentils, okay? Take as much as the lentils, take that much rice, Sir. That's how it would be translated, okay? But notice, for those of you who have looked at expressions like exactly, and Ezra was talking about precision marking at the very beginning of our event here, and there are expressions in languages which are called slack regulators, which are like exactly or precisely, which can combine with expressions that are often used loosely, right? So if I say the train came at 3 o'clock, I allow for the train to arrive at 2:59 or 3:02. Or something like that. But if I say that train came exactly at 3 o'clock, I prevent any such interpretation from arising. So in a way, exactly functions as a slack regulator that tightens loose talk and prevents the utterance of propositions that are strictly false. So I cannot do that, okay? So this is just a point to keep in mind. It can also precisify spatial and temporal indexicals, and there it has the effect of right. And if anybody has an analysis for right in English when it occurs in right there or right then, I would love to know what it is, because I haven't seen one yet. But that's the function that it has. Nisha is telling Bilal about her daughter getting hurt recently. That's the context. Nisha says, we were just heading out to see a movie last evening, and then, she fell down the stairs. Okay, exactly then she fell down the stairs. That's the inference that we get here. Okay? It can occur with universal quantifiers and negative polarity items. And when it does that, it conveys that you don't want to interpret these quantifier expressions in loose, imprecise ways. So it serves to raise the standard of precision to the highest level, very similar to what absolutely does in English, okay? So Anu and Bilal heard news about a recent earthquake. Anu says, do you know what the power situation was like? Bilal says it was pretty bad. They lost power absolutely everywhere. So they lost power everywhere, sir, okay? Or there was no power anywhere, sir. That's kind of the use of the expression, and the effect is similar to that, absolutely. You can also use it with vague determiners like many and much, intensifiers like very, and the effect of "ts" is that you get a boosted standard, right? It's like really or very. So yesterday, a lot "ts" rain fell, as in 13. It's saying something like yesterday, it really rained a lot. Bilal, here's another example. Bilal tried a new Indian restaurant in Austin, and Anu wants to know more about it. Anu says, what's the food there like? Bilal says, I was impressed. The food is very tasty, really very tasty, okay? I'm going to just give you an example of mirativity and then kind of move on a little bit. Ezra, how much time do I have? Hello? Ezra? Hi.
Maybe I'll punt that over to the organizers. Should we try to aim to stop a little bit before 5 or at 5 exactly?
Okay.
Hello. Well, okay. Maybe, should I make an executive decision? How does?
Sorry. We usually start to we usually aim to end at 5, or we usually want to close the talk at 5, and then we have 30 minutes for questions and stuff.
Excellent. That's
We've got a good 18 minutes.
Okay, excellent. I thought I had less, so I'm very happy. Okay, great. So TSA can also have a mirative effect. It can be used to convey that the proposition denoted by its predicate is surprising and deviates upward from contextual expectation. So here's the context. Anu had given her daughter permission to invite a few friends for her birthday party, and Bilal is like, how many friends did she invite? Says it was crazy. She invited the whole class. Okay, so this is she just invited the whole class. And the inference is that the number of invitees was much higher than contextually expected. Okay, I'm going to skip the scalar additive cases for now, and just give you a recap kind of the discourse sensitive and scale sensitive effects that are associated with TSA. The first two here are similar to indeed and this very or that very, which is a kind of a case of discourse salience, and the others which we just saw were exclusivity, precisification, intensification, and mirativity, and so on. So this is the range of effects, and the question is, what do you do with them, right? So the challenge is to derive the availability of this full range of effects from a single lexical entry. And I'm saying that we require a single lexical entry because when you have a phenomenon that cuts across languages and cuts across temporal periods, you tend to want to think of such a phenomenon as being a unified phenomenon. And I think I was talking to Demet in the morning about this, like you really don't want fragmented, splintered explanations for these kind of things, because if you do that, then you know, it's highly likely the case that you just don't know how to analyze the phenomenon rather than the phenomenon itself being a splintered object, right? So the challenge is to derive the availability of the range of effects from a single lexical entry in interaction with linguistic and extralinguistic contextual information and a lot of pragmatic reasoning, okay? So I'm kind of moving towards the analysis and just giving you a taste of how this would look. There's a manuscript associated with this talk that I will refer you to at the end. But I really want the ideas to come across and for you to evaluate them at that level. Okay? So what did I say? I said that it presupposes that the proposition expressed by the prejacent is a Schelling point among the alternatives in the current question. So it presupposes that the prejacent interpretation, the way in which we interpret the contribution of the speaker, can be coordinated on by interlocutors by virtue of being uniquely salient. Okay. There are two kinds of situations we can have when prior discourse moves or shared interlocutor beliefs or expectations provide such a mutually salient proposition, right? So if the question has been asked and the answerer is kind of saying yes to the question or responding positively to the question, then we already have something that's been rendered mutually salient. And in those sorts of cases, we get the discourse sensitive salience or discourse groundedness effect. But when the prejacent contains expressions that present us with a wide range of interpretive choices, the speaker and the addressee must rely on a mutual understanding of how and why the prejacent can be construed as salient in order for their communication to be successful. In other words, the addressee kind of must have go-to strategies for coordinating with their speaker on the intended interpretation of the prejacent. And here I'm going to say that sentences like the food is tasty, or the accident happened there, or my daughter fell down the stairs then. All of these expressions have, all of these sentences contain vague expressions, and the speaker and the addressee must coordinate on a correct interpretation of the intended interpretation of such vague expressions. And is kind of facilitating that process in those cases where sentences have an underdetermined or underspecified meaning. Okay. So some assumptions that I'll be making are coming from the literature on discourse particles and focus sensitive, scale sensitive particles in English. So I'll just kind of articulate some of these assumptions. Any declarative utterance answers a possibly implicit question. So declarative utterances are answers to questions, but the questions themselves need not have been produced in the context. A question is modeled as a set of alternative answers, and this comes from work by Hamblin, later work by Karttunen, Grunendijk, and Stokhoff. So this is kind of the whole tradition of work on questions, where a question is, a question denotation is the set of alternative answers. Okay. What does it mean to have information at a discourse context? What is the structure of a context? A context provides a common ground, which is the content that interlocutors share, they take for granted. A context also provides a current question, which I've been kind of throwing around in the talk, but the idea is that at any stage in discourse, there is some issue, some question that interlocutors are interested in resolving, which means that there is some set of alternative answers that is looming in the background at any context that we are in. In addition to that, Beaver and Clark and Coppock and Beaver and other people later as well have proposed that these set of alternative answers are actually ordered with respect to each other. They might be stronger than each other or weaker than each other. And I just want to kind of say, what does that even mean? So imagine a question like, what did Anu make? Now, alternative answers to this question could be, she made pulao and raita and chicken, okay? Or she made pulao and raita, or she made pulao, she made raita, right? So these are kind of possible alternative answers. And you might order these answers in terms of how much information they give. And it's kind of obvious that a sentence like she made pulao gives us less information than she made pulao plus raita plus chicken, right? So it's informatively weaker. And she made pulao plus raita plus chicken is informatively stronger than she made pulao by itself, right? So in this sort of an ordering of alternative answers, stronger alternatives logically entail weaker alternatives. But we can also have an idea of answers being stronger because how much they deviate from our expectation, or how newsworthy they are, how likely they are. And this sort of an ordering over answers is also invoked in analyses that involve scale-sensitive expressions like just or even in English, right? So if I say Nancy is just a genius, I'm kind of considering alternatives that are weaker than that. Like, she is super intelligent, she is okay, she is not very smart. So a range of possibilities, possible answers about what, degree of intellectual caliber, for instance, Nancy has. And when I say Nancy is just a genius, I'm kind of ordering it at the very top of that scale of alternatives. But this is not logical strength. It's strength with respect to noteworthiness, right? Or Nancy just barged into the house is like she was not expected to do that. The scale of unexpectedness is what is invoked here. So in this pragmatic ordering of alternatives, stronger alternatives are more surprising in comparison to weaker alternatives. And so the idea is here that, yes, you can get salience for certain propositions through discourse by the fact that somebody uttered them or that they are in the shared background of interlocutors. But you can also get salience by virtue of an answer lying in a particular position, by it being the strongest or the weakest answer among a set of ordered answers. And this is inspired by work on scalar expressions, so gradable adjectives in particular, like open and closed and tall and expressions like this, that takes endpoints of scales to be things that are salient to interlocutors. And I'm referring here to work by Chris Kennedy and its interpretation by Chris Potts and Mikhail Franke and so on. But the idea is that the need for the speaker and the hearer to coordinate on mutually shared standards for these sorts of adjectives leads to the selection of salient values for such standards. And what do I mean here? I'm just going to take a minute to talk about this, right? So, imagine there's a scale for open, okay, the adjective open. There's a scale of openness, and you can think of a door, the degree to which the door is open, and the openness of a door can have can lie somewhere on the scale of openness. But the most salient point against which we judge the adjective open is the minimum point, right? So even if the door is open a crack, we would say that the door is open. So the minimum point on the scale of openness is a salient one for interlocutors to coordinate on. For the scale of closedness, even if the door is 98% closed, we would say that the door is not closed because the end point that is salient for the interpretation of an adjective like closed is the maximum point or the strongest point, okay? The end point, the upper end point. So these are kind of ideas that have been around in the literature for gradable adjectives. And the idea is that these are usage conditions on gradable adjectives that come from the fact that the speaker and the hearer have to coordinate on how we interpret these kinds of adjectives, and we select salient values, and endpoints are salient values. So that's kind of what I'm transposing on to an understanding of Tse here. Okay. So Tse makes no at-issue contribution, simply imposes a felicity condition on the contexts in which it occurs. And it's felicitous at a context, and the lexical entry is given to you in 18. It's felicitous at a context, see if the contextual interpretation of its prejacent is a Schelling point among the alternatives in the current question, okay? So a Tse using speaker presupposes that the alternative they are conveying by uttering the sentence is uniquely mutually salient. Such a speaker is faced with the same sort of problem that a speaker who utters a sentence like the door is open or the door is closed is faced with. They need their interlocutor to coordinate on the contextual kind of to coordinate on the intended interpretation of the sentence. So a speaker who utters a sentence with sir must be confident in the addressee's ability at the context to uniquely recover the intended proposition using pragmatic reasoning. There are two kinds of cases here. If the speaker's utterance requires the addressee to resolve values for contextual variables, right? So if you said, it happened then, what exactly do you mean? Or if you said that the food is tasty, what is the threshold against which I must interpret a predicate like tasty? Or if you said that everyone came to the party, how should I really be interpreting your quantifier expression there? How loosely, how precisely? These are problems that speakers and hearers are dealing with, all the time. So these require the addressee to resolve values for contextual variables in order to infer the speaker intended meaning. And what Sir says is that there is a unique mutually salient resolution, okay? And because it provides this instruction, the addressee must determine which interpretation they must choose, okay? Also, there are utterances that do not involve any context sensitivity. So these don't contain vague expressions. The speaker must presuppose that the interlocutors are coordinated on the structure of the question and the position of the proposition relative to the contextually given order. Okay? I'm going to talk a little bit about this. So this is just saying, what does it mean for a proposition to be a Schelling point in a question, right? That's what this thing on the left-hand side says. They say, well, it's a Schelling point if the proposition is a minimal element on a scale of alternatives, or it is a maximal element, it's the strongest thing on a scale of alternatives, or it is a proposition that the speaker and the addressee are already jointly attending to. So what this set of conditions gives us is the possibility of reconciling discourse-sensitive salience, when two people find a proposition salient because of their shared beliefs, the prior discourse, and so on, and scale-sensitive salience, where people just hone in on an interpretation or coordinate on an interpretation because of which position it occupies on a scale of alternatives. Okay. Okay, so I'll just derive one effect here, the effect of precisification, and then move towards the conclusion. Thank you, Ezra, for the reminder. Okay, so what does this whole thing that I said actually do for us when we have to account for these uses? Okay, so imagine a context in which the speaker utters, they lost electricity everywhere. Tsa. Okay, so tsa is attached to everywhere. Now, this the hearer has to reason. Well, the prejacent that they use, they lost electricity everywhere, is already a maximal element in the question, right? The question is, where did they lose electricity? And you can kind of think of alternatives as the areas in which, or the proportion of areas in which they lost electricity. So everywhere is the strongest claim you can make anyway. It's already a maximal element. What purpose might serve here? The hearer is thinking. Here it says, well, by using tse, the speaker has made salient those propositional alternatives that may vary not only with respect to what proportion of places have lost electricity, but also by how precisely the lexical expressions that express this proportion are to be interpreted. How should I interpret everywhere? By using tse, the speaker has signaled that they care to distinguish between interpretations of the prejacent at higher versus lower standards of precision. By focusing on more versus less precise alternatives that are the meaning of the same sentence, and presupposing that one of them is mutually salient, the speaker is directing attention to the most precise interpretation of the prejacent, and the hearer reasons that they should coordinate with the speaker on this interpretation and shift to the highest standard of precision. And this is what precisification amounts to. Okay, so there are similar analyses for each of the uses that I have talked about. And I just want to kind of move to the conclusion. I'll share these slides with you if you want to go over them later. But what am I trying to kind of present here as a bigger picture? It's a conceptualization of discourse interactions as involving coordination on crucial components of the context. So what do we share in terms of information? How are we interpreting contextual thresholds? What are we assuming contextual thresholds to be? What are we taking the question to be? We require coordination of all of these in order to have successful communication. I'm providing you with a proposal that the chameleon-like discourse particle of like Marathi is directly making reference to the availability of shelling points that are coordinable among the alternatives in a question. And there are several reasons why alternatives might be presupposed to be uniquely salient or shelling points at a context. And it's the different ways in which these alternatives become salient, as Schelling already notes. There are many ways of doing this. It's the ways in which they become salient that actually gives rise to this multiplicity of effects that we observe in the case of Tse. Okay, so I've offered you a unified analysis or the beginning of an analysis for Tse, and this proposal probably extends with minor differences to other languages in the Indo-Aryan family as well. The innovation here is that we are now making reference to this higher order property, a higher level property, which is the presence of unique alternatives available for coordination. And this property can be, or the signaling for coordination is something that might be shared across discourse particles and discourse structure and functions across languages, okay? So I think that this way of thinking can open the door to a better understanding of discourse tracking particles cross-linguistically. And in particular, it makes some sense of why we find across languages that discourse salience, exclusivity, mirativity, precisification, and intensification are clustered together in the same lexical item. And I think that kind of the way of thinking about this is that expressions that don't package this in the same lexical item. So whenever you don't get packaging in a single lexical item, but rather packaging in distinct lexical items like exclusives, like additives, like miratives, like precisifiers or intensifiers, all of them share something. They have in common. They all signal a need for matching interlocutor expectations. And this is a function that a dedicated shelling point invoking device like Tse can perform single-handedly. Okay, so the manuscript for this talk, the paper is available here, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that talk. That was exceedingly clear, and like I'm going to steal some of your explanations of discourse structure for sure. And very incredibly inspired. Like I'm thinking of lots of connections and things. So yes, the people on Zoom are clapping to themselves as Jen. Okay, very good. So at this point, just remind everyone, we're going to take questions, and we're going to try to distribute the questions between the people there at the watch party and the people on Zoom. If you're interested in asking a question on Zoom, remember, please use the raise hand. Or if for some reason you can't do that, you may alternatively use the Q&A. And the people in person obviously can just raise your hand and get the attention of the two organizers sitting in the front there. So let's see. Questions.
So we can take any questions in the audience. And like Ezra said, we can also take questions on Zoom, but we'll just pass out the microphone to whoever has a question. Ezra, can you hear me?
Yes. So that microphone's working. Great.
So I see a question from Savi.
Oh.
the question? Should I take it?
So what we can do is Mackenzie can promote her to a panelist, and then Savi can ask her question, unless Savi throws in the chat or says that she would rather you just read it. So.
Sorry, I have a little baby here, so you might hear some weird noises. Thank you so much for your talk. That was so, yeah, like Ezra said, so clear. And I was really, excited to think more about this type of particle. So it seems to me, because I know you're interested also in diachrony of these types of things, like it seems to me, for example, unlikely that you would maybe have like one thing I could imagine, right? If when there's like a particle that has many different functions or meanings, that maybe you start out with one meaning and then it gets extended to another meaning, or that the one function, it gets extended, for example. That seems to be like, based on your account, unlikely, but I'm curious, like, maybe to the extent you've looked at cross-linguistic differences, maybe there are certain like hints at what might be more core or older functions or meanings of this, or maybe that's not the right way to think about it. So I'm just curious if that's something you're looking at, or what you can say about that idea.
Thanks a lot, Savi. I mean, so I'm usually looking for little paths of change, right? Like that's what I look into the history for. But what's interesting is when one looks at Middle Indo-Aryan or Old Indo-Aryan, you really find the full set of uses there as well. And critically, which I hope I was able to convey this, because sometimes I felt like I'm not able to show the kind of, there are two, in some sense, discrete phenomena. One is salience that is based on discourse moves and shared knowledge. And the other is salience that is simply based on how you should think of the position of a sentence or an answer in an ordered question, right? So there you don't really have any access to what's familiar in the discourse or what has been made salient in the discourse. What I think is interesting about a language like English, for instance, is that English has expressions like indeed and that very, which are discourse sensitive salience marking, and expressions like just, which mark scale sensitive salience, right? So there you can say it's just amazing, or, he's just an intern, but also just every color was represented there. So you have all these uses which are scale sensitive, but you don't get a kind of a putting together of both these types of salience in a single lexical item. So I thought, well, maybe one of these is prior and then the other one comes through. I just don't have any evidence for that. But one thing I do imagine is that across languages, we might find these kind of patterns, languages in which there are two expressions, one of which is reserved for discourse sensitive, or two types of expressions, one for discourse sensitive salience, the other for scale sensitive salience, and languages which kind of conflate the two, where it's Schelling point salience, that's it. And then, again, it's the kind of thing that you can imagine, like, to the extent that it's an instruction to coordinate. It seems like a very simple thing, right? The problem is really, okay, how do we coordinate now? You're telling me to coordinate, but what should I do? And that's kind of the sort of, that's the question where the answer to the diachronic trajectory might actually be far before, right, what we have a linguistic record for. But I don't know. I'm just making this up, okay? So thank you.
It looks like we have another question in the Q&A. Unless I don't see any hands in the audience. We have one from, maybe we'll let Acrizio ask his question and then we'll do another virtual question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Thank you.
That was a great talk, very interesting. A lot more than I could digest in the time. Yeah, a lot of information here, but really exciting. You mentioned a little bit about romance. That's set of languages that I know a little bit more about. Would you be able to comment on anything related to these properties in Romance regarding the kinds of expressions that would actually show the effects that you're looking at?
I would not. I know a little bit about the expressions in Germanic, but I actually don't know what the landscape looks like in Romance. I just know there is a landscape, and I know that people have worked on it, but I haven't actually. I'm sorry, but I don't really have immediate kind of access to the findings and the main results from the Romance literature or discourse particles.
So you have this sort of split in English, right, between just and even. And some of the translations that you are giving for some of the expressions are like an anaphoric meaning that translates to same, at least in Portuguese and in French. And that would be sort of equivalent to even. So that's one way in which these expressions get cashed out. So there is an only expression and there is a same. That would be the equivalent of that. That can also be used as a reflexive, as a third person reflexive in these languages. And there is also even a preposition that is derived from Arabic that has a meaning of up to, that ends up being hacia in Spanish. And I don't know whether Spanish actually has these meanings, but Portuguese has in the corresponding version of that. So you have a set of sort of these common expressions like up to in the Iberian languages, and then you have same as well, and then only, of course. So sort of like cutting across these different expressions. And then you talked about I don't know anything about Sanskrit, but you gave the version of this, what would be the origin of this, which is Eva, right? I assume that would have some correlation to the fact that you have even in English, because in German you have eben, and I assume there would have some source to this. But one interesting thing is that the German eben is used in affirmative clauses, not in negative clauses, to indicate something that unfortunately has happened. So I just thought I was curious about these connections there to those two language families.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for all this information here. So with Eva and even, it is not clear to me that they are cognates to each other, because I think even starts out, the original meaning of even is in fact the lexical meaning that even has. And then it acquires a discourse meaning at a later point in time, while a Sanskrit Eva, which is attested in pretty old texts, like I would say, even going back to the 4th century BC and so on, is already grammaticalized as a discourse particle. So it would be kind of strange to think of the Sanskrit Eva and the Germanic Eben to be, functionally cognate to each other at a prehistoric period. That is, that's the shared kind of past of these languages. But there is, there's super interesting stuff that needs to be understood in terms of the shared discourse particle past of these languages. So for instance, and I'll just point to one which Henk Zevat and I have been thinking about, which is Doc in German and To in the Indo-Aryan languages, and Hindi in particular, which have a common kind of a ancestor, which is realized. So the cognate in the Sanskrit language is tu there. So there is a kind of a diachronic story to be told about Indo-European discourse categories and how they evolve in each of the daughter language families. But I don't, that takes it's kind of hard to carefully, see where the differences lie and why the differences are the way they are. This observation that you made with same and even and the reflexive like that's another clustering of functions, right? Where reflexives can be used to do this anaphoric demonstrative like meaning, right? Like that same or that very thing. And I don't know if I understood correctly, you can use it to say that very, but you can also use it to convey scale sensitive even, right? Like a scalar additive. Is that how it works in Romance? Sorry, I couldn't hear.
The same can be used to indicate the end of a scale, the sort of like one of the tipping points. And sorry if I'm not making the correct connection to what you talked about in terms of scale sensitivity, but it's just that you reach the tip of the scale and you use same in that context.
But so to say something like, John was so nice to me, he even put me up for the night or something like that. You would use the same, that expression that you use as a reflexive? Yes, and in French, you would do it with just the same alone. In Portuguese, you would do it with same added to up to. So it gets a more complex structure there. But it is the expression that is used as a reflexive. Right, right. I mean, so that's another kind of a trajectory that one might want to make sense of. Like, what is it about reflexives that allow us to direct attention to salient points in on a scale, or salient points that are answers in a discourse context, right? Which is the one that you get with that very or indeed type of interpretations. So I haven't seen just that particular combination in Indo-Aryan, like this reflexive even and discourse sensitive salience kind of coming together, but it's fascinating. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, I think we've let it wait long enough, so we'll move on to Doug, who has a question in the chat or in the Q&A.
In the Q&A, okay.
He was raising his hand, so he'll, will you ask your question out loud, Doug?
Yes, I'm sorry. When I was promoted to panelist, it took me out of Zoom for a second. I didn't realize you were calling me. Yes, so a brilliant talk. I understood more than I thought I would, which means you did a great job explaining it. I wanted to ask about humor. So humor often depends on treating a less salient interpretation as the more salient interpretation, and particularly like irony and so forth. So I don't know, are particles like, are they used ironically? Are they used humorously? And how does that work with respect to salience?
Okay, this is I must say I've never thought about humor for Tse, but there's something that it does, which is on the face of it, like, how can this work? So suppose it's clear that we are antagonists in discourse. We don't agree with each other, right? So let's say we are fighting and the dispute is over who started the fight, okay? Clearly, we're not going to agree with each other that, you know, I think you started it, you think I started it, okay? In such a context, if you say, well, Ashwini, you started the fight, and I say, Doug, you started the fight. That's perfect, okay? Now that's perfect, and that's not really, that makes no sense because we are not cooperating interlocutors. But what we are doing is some kind of an imposition, or what I'm doing rather, is imposing coordination. I'm saying we can be coordinated because the answer is obvious. The true answer is obvious in the context. You started the fight, right? And we can be coordinated on this. So what I've looked at is a lot of unaligned cases where interlocutors are in fact polarized, in fact cannot come to coordinated understandings, and the kind of passive-aggressive effect that Tse has in these sorts of contexts, right? Because it's imposing coordination when the context is clearly one in which the interlocutors are unaligned. with each other. So humor might be a less kind of a polarized case that one could explore, but I can't think, like I would have to really like do a search to see where it is used in jokes. But of course, ironically, you could use it as well, right? To indicate that the interpretation that is coordinated on is actually ironically being presented to you, right? Not right. In a sincere fashion and things like that. But I would have to think about that. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. Promise asked a question a little bit ago. Unless she puts in the chat that she would rather not ask it, we'll promote her to panelists. So Promise McIntyre. Mackenzie, if we could promote her and she can ask her question.
Okay, can you hear me? That's the first time I've ever done that. Interesting. Okay, so my question was going back to something we were talking about a few turns ago, and I was wondering, what do you think do you think that there is a relationship between the magnitude of linguistic diversity in this area and the clustering of effects in the single lexical item versus, for example, having it be more like English in separate lexical items? And if you do think that they're related, what do you think that relationship is?
Thank you for that question. So by the magnitude of linguistic diversity, we are talking about the Indian subcontinent and the language families and the languages represented there?
Yes. I wouldn't know how to reason about that connection. I mean, one of the things that could be the case is we are talking about a long-term contact situation, a multilingual, multi-ethnic kind of situation over large kind of geographical areas, and having a pragmatic content that is kind of shared across these languages, and that doesn't require a lot of acquisitional complexity, could be a useful thing to have in such multilingual speech communities. But I wouldn't know to argue that. But I do want to say one thing, I promise, that it's not like Indo-Aryan languages don't have exclusives, or that they don't have additives, or that they don't have intensifiers. Yeah, these occur in addition to these markers, or to tsa, or tsa can occur by itself. So there are expressions that separately package some subset of these meanings, but tsa and Hindi hi or Marathi or Gujarati ja, like these functional cognates I'm talking about, are basically just able to dexterously do everything by themselves, sometimes cooperating with other more dedicated devices, but they don't need them. So it's not impoverishment. It's just flexibility that we are seeing here. Does that make sense? Yeah. So is it the case with those other items that you mentioned? Are they equally are they likewise distributed amongst all of these different languages?
Okay. So what you're saying then is, let's say that there is this basic all-purpose guide that's found in all the languages, but then when we start cutting the pie, is the pie cut in the same way in Marathi, Hindi, Gujarati, Bangla? And that's a question that I would love to be able to answer.
there are similarities, but there are also obvious differences, or rather not so obvious different. Like the differences are obvious, but why they are there is not obvious. Definitely the pie is not cut in exactly the same way in these languages when they actually start lexicalizing individual functions. So that's actually a really, really interesting thing to try and address. Like, why would that be the case? Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know if I answered what you wanted, but that's the best that
it gives you some ideas. Thank you.
All right, we probably have time for one more question. So if are there any questions in the audience here?
I have some questions, unless there's something there I can't really see.
I don't think so, Ezra. You're. Why don't you go?
Okay, I'm allowed to go next. Okay, I probably have about 5 or 6 questions, but maybe I'll just ask. So, I have some specific questions. Like, it seems to be attaching to the focused item. Is that right? Okay, so that was interesting to me. But maybe I'll ask like a more broad question. Like, so I was wondering, you touched on this a little bit, but does this particle itself enforce this kind of coordination between the participants? Like, does it add new information that helps them get this, or does it reflect existing coordination, or is it both, or is it some like negotiation between these? That was just a sort of like a more general question I had about the particle.
No, and that's really a very important question, because the way I present it, I say that it presupposes coordination. Okay, what do you do when there is no coordination? It's what we do every time when we are presupposing stuff that we shouldn't be presupposing. We produce it, and then we force our interlocutors to coordinate, to accommodate, and then if they don't, then we have a crash, right? So it's kind of, that's how I'm thinking of it, that it presupposes coordination, and thereby it enforces coordination, right? By presupposing it. But I really want to think about it more in terms of like, is there an instructional meaning that we can give this sort of an expression? Like, is it just like a command, coordinate, rather than a proposition, we are coordinated, right? Because you can think of we are coordinated as stating a fact about the world, or a deontic kind of a command that obligates the addressee to be in some way. So you can think of that either way, but I haven't really yet come to a clear kind of argument for why one would want it to be an instruction, like an imperative, coordinate, versus a statement, a reported, like, a declarative, we are coordinated, which then has deontic effects as we talk to our interlocutors. But this is exactly what I was thinking about all day today. Like, how do I want to think about this? There was a third option maybe that you suggested that I don't remember.
Oh, I just said that might it reflect the coordination that exists? That's a little bit more like presupposition, I guess. And I said, or both, or does it like start a negotiation, basically? Like,
does it start? Yeah. It doesn't start a negotiation. That is one thing. Like, you don't, once you have produced a containing sentence, then you don't have options, for instance, of negotiating on, well, what is our standard of precision, or what is our contextual threshold? You have to move to the highest level, or once that happens. So that's eliminatable.
Great, thanks. Well, maybe I'll just send you an email with some of my other questions.
Oh, thank you. That would be great as well.
Yeah, no, thank you. This was so interesting and sparked a lot of interest amongst our audience here too.
Thank you.
Yes,
okay.
Maybe we'll just give one last round of applause. Ezra, do you have any conclusions?
Yeah, no, that's all I was going to say. Let's thank our speaker one more time, and feel free to put some words in the chat if you want, or just clap by yourself in your room. I will do the same. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone, for having me and for listening to me so patiently. So this was great.
Well, take care, and send my regards to Austin. Some of my family live there now.
Okay.
My mother and my brother. So.
Okay, and do they like it?
Yeah. I think they like that. My mother likes that it never gets too cold. She complains when she comes here and it's like 55 degrees now, even though she grew up in Boston, like New York and Boston.
Yeah, well, but when you visit, you should tell us, and then
I'll let you know.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.